Hello, my name is Kevin Slappey, and this is my capstone project. The topic of my project is going to be on timbre, and more specifically, I'm going to look for a solid definition of it. I'm going to try to figure out how to analyze it, organize it, and then hopefully, by the end, apply what I've learned. The reason that I chose this topic is because in pretty much everything I do as a musician, I work with timbre all the time, even though I didn't really know what it is or like how it works. Specifically, when I write my own music, I like to design my own sounds. It's fun for me, and I feel like it gives me a bit of a unique take on my own music, so it's enjoyable to do. But one of my frustrations is that sometimes when I'm trying to design a sound, I can't even conceptualize it. Like I can hear it in my head, I know what I want it to sound like, but I have no idea what words could describe it or how it would translate to a synthesizer or other means of creating sounds. So it's a big frustration of mine, and I wanted to figure out how can I learn more about this. So I started to do some research, and I found that it was actually a pretty ambiguous topic. There's not a whole lot of consensus on what it is. So my first step was to just simple search online, find some common definitions. These are just a few definitions taken from various websites, from dictionary websites. So the first one is from the Cambridge English Dictionary, and this definition is a quality of sound that makes voices or musical instruments sound different from each other. I felt like this definition was not very helpful. A quality of sound is pretty ambiguous, but it does tell me that there's, something about the sound that distinguishes one sound from another. In this case, they say voices are musical instruments, but I think we can generalize it to any sound from any sound. But it's very, very vague, so I didn't feel like that was very helpful. Webster's definition was a little bit better in my opinion. It is the quality given to a sound by its overtones. The reason I like this one a bit more is because now we have the word overtones. We have something physical and tangible that we can look to for what the quality comes from. So I like that, but it's still a little lacking. Dictionary.com's definition was the best that I could find, including among some research papers that I read that also proposed definitions. I still felt like Dictionary.com's was actually the most all-encompassing. And that is the characteristic quality of a sound independent of pitch and loudness from which its source or manner of production can be inferred. Timbre depends on the relative strengths of the components of different frequencies, which are determined by resonance. Things that I like about this one, we still have the characteristic quality of a sound, so we still have, some descriptor of the sound, and we have that it comes from the relative strengths of the components of different frequencies. So this is similar to the overtones from Webster's, but it's much more in-depth. Now we're not just worrying about specific frequencies, it's any frequencies, all frequencies, and their relative strengths. So I really like that. A couple of things that I disagree with or don't like is actually that the source or manner of production can be inferred. I don't actually think that needs to be included in timbre. I think there are certain sounds where we know what they sound like, but we don't necessarily know where it came from, such as synthesized sounds. And independent of pitch, I actually disagree with a little bit too. And I will need to explain that because that was one aspect of timbre that was generally agreed upon in almost all of the research that I read, is that timbre is independent of pitch. So I'll need to explain why I disagree, but in order to get there, I want to lay some groundwork and build up to that. So I'm going to circle back and come back to that in a little bit. So I figured it's best to just start from the beginning and figure out, timbre is describing sound, so what is sound? With sound, there's typically an event or an interaction where two things interact and create a vibration. So if you think of like clapping your hands together, or your vocal cords rubbing together, or blowing air into an instrument, just some sort of event happens that produces vibrations. The vibrations cause pressure waves to travel outwards in the surrounding material. Often the way we experience that is air particles, pressure waves in the air particles. And I'm actually going to call them sound waves from now on, for simplicity's sake. And then our ears receive the sound waves, and our brain interprets those sound waves to make us experience sound. The thing that I care most about is these sound waves, because that's what we actually experience as sound, and that's the thing that we can measure. if we're going to measure it, what parameters can we measure? There's really just two. We've got amplitude, which is the strength of the sound wave, and this is often measured in decibels, and so we usually think of this as like how loud a sound is. That comes from amplitude. And then there's frequency, which is how long it takes for a wave to complete its wave cycle, and this is measured in hertz, and we generally experience this as pitch. So you think a lower frequency is a lower pitch, higher is higher. And this is the range of human hearing is from somewhere around 20 hertz to somewhere around 20,000 hertz. So it's a pretty wide range of hearing. But if there's just two measurable parameters, you know, how complicated can it be? It can be very complicated. It can get really, really crazy. Because the thing is that when we hear sounds, a lot of the time, we are not hearing one sound wave at one frequency at one amplitude. We are often hearing a ton of different sound waves at different frequencies and different amplitudes. What we're looking at right now is a frequency spectrum analyzer, and I was just playing some random sounds through it, and the sounds audibly were very clear and simple for me to understand, but visually we can see that there's a lot going on. Tons of different frequencies, tons of different amplitudes, all across the spectrum, and they actually, this is just a still frame, but they often change very quickly in a short period of time. So there's the physical, measurable aspect of timbre, which is the sound waves, but I think that's not all there is to it, because I think that we also have to consider our own personal experience of sound and our interpretation of what we're hearing. So I would consider that this aspect, the subjective side of timbre, because we can see in all of those definitions the words like characteristic or quality, which are a little ambiguous, but they generally describe how we perceive a sound, which is not always clearly defined and objective. And this is why I think that pitch does matter in timbre in extreme cases. I think note to note, even like octave to octave, not a big deal. But I think for some sounds, if they leave their expected frequency range that we have for them, we don't perceive them as being that sound anymore. So I think of things like if a bass guitar plays a low E and that gets pitched up 7 octaves, we don't think that's a bass guitar anymore. It has left the realm of its expected frequency range. Same thing with like a human voice. If they sing a high C and we pitch that down 5 octaves, I don't even know if that would sound like a human voice anymore. It might sound like just a big jumble, even though theoretically the relationship between the frequencies should still be the same. So I think in very extreme cases, pitch can be a factor in timbre. In order to define timbre, we should acknowledge both the objective side and the subjective side of it, because I think timbre is both and their relationship with each other. So this brings me to my proposed definition of timbre, which is the subjective interpretation of the relative amplitudes of the audible frequency spectrum and their change over time. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. I just spoke about the subjective interpretation, so that's just our experience of sound. The relative amplitudes of the audible frequency spectrum, this was partially influenced by that dictionary.com definition. I really, really like that it is relative, because I think for any given sound, you can turn down the volume on the whole sound, and the absolute values of the amplitudes will go down, but it still sounds like the same sound. It's just quieter. So I think it's the relative values to each other that matters. I think it's their relationship that matters. And then lastly, their change over time, which I haven't spoken a whole lot about yet, but I think not all the sounds that we hear are static. In fact, I think very few sounds that we hear are static. I think that most of the sounds that we hear on a daily basis change very quickly. And I think this factors into our perception of their timbre very strongly. And so to describe this, I'm just going to take a pretty common sound, which is the sound of water. So let's play that. So we hear it's just water. It's about a 2-second clip. And what I have over here on the left side is the frequency spectrum analyzer again. And what it's going to do, I played the water sound through it, and it's going to show the frequency response in real time. So we'll see how the sound changes and how the amplitudes of the frequencies change over time. Now, for that 2-second clip, there's going to be a lot of change in a short amount of time. So what I did was I slowed it down to 10% speed, and I only pulled 0.5 seconds. So let's see how much it changes in 0.5 seconds. So as we can see, a lot happens in a very, very brief amount of time. Actually, we could see that individual frames because we slowed it down so much. I'm just going to play it one more time, and I want to focus this time on trying to track how much individual frequencies change their amplitudes on sort of a micro level, because this is going to be very important as we move forward. So we see that the sound fades in and sort of achieves this general contour, but then on a tiny scale, each individual frequency is constantly shifting its amplitude, and this is over 0.5 seconds. And so much happens in such a short amount of time. Now, I think what's really interesting about this, what really made me curious, is that despite all of this change, it does maintain this consistent shape. This sort of, I could draw a line over the contour of the frequency response, and it would hold that shape for the duration of the clip, which is fascinating. That despite all that change, it still kind of maintains a general outline. So this brings me to my next point, which is that I think timbre can be thought of in kind of two general categories for any given sound. Not that it should be thought of, but that it can be thought of this way, which is the macro and the micro level of the frequency response. So the macro is what I would consider as that large general contour, the general outline. And even if you wanted to break it down a bit more into sort of like frequency bands, like maybe 20 hertz to 300, so on and so on, I think still just general large visible patterns on a macro level is one way to perceive the frequency response and its effect on timbre. Then the other level is the micro level, which is those constantly shifting, just tiny frequency amplitudes that are moving up and down very, very quickly. So I think both of these contribute to timbre, but you can kind of track them separately. And thinking along these lines, it made me very curious because I think of water as a very dynamic sound. I think of rushing water as having going from peaking in the high end to maybe in the mid-range and having constantly shifting things. So it was fascinating to me that despite all of that change, it maintained a really consistent shape of the frequency response on the macro level. So it got me thinking, I wonder if we can find patterns in the frequency responses of various sounds that inform us about why we might group those sounds together. So I'm thinking about such complicated sounds as like the human voice. We can discern different speakers from each other. Like if I have one friend speaking over here and another over here, I can tell which is which, but I still group those sounds as being the human voice. So why is that? Why do we perceive them as being in that same family, even though we can clearly tell them apart? So I'm wondering if there's patterns that we can find on a macro or micro level that would inform us as to why we perceive it that way. That's going to conclude part 1 of my capstone project. And in part 2, I'm going to explore the idea of patterns more in depth and do some actual analysis. Thank you.